So again, welcome. My name is Chuck Anderson. I'm a vice president with the Mission Advancement team, and we're glad to have you here for today's presentation on crafting the donor story. First of all, let me let you know our CEO, Skylar Lehman, is unable to join us today. He had some travel conflict due to some snow up in the Midwest. But Kyle Queel, one of our vice presidents and one of my colleagues here, is going to be presenting. I will introduce Kyle here in just a few moments. But first of all, a couple of technical housekeeping items. We will have some time for Q&A, some question and answer at the end of today's presentation. So you can use the questions tab there in your control panel. Send those questions to me and I'll be moderating those at the end of today's discussion. So use that questions tab for any questions you have throughout the presentation. We'll address those at the end. Also use that questions tab for any technical issues that you may have. One tip I'll give: if you have some lag or something in the audio or video feed, close out all your other programs and free up the bandwidth. Also, we want you to know that we will have a full video recording of today's presentation available on our website at missionadvancement.com. So watch for an email later this week when we have that up and running. We do want to let you know that we have a number of other recorded sessions that are on our website and our webinar library. Those are free of charge all the time. You can find those at missionadvancement.com. Things about capital campaigns, donor relationships, the structure of your development team and office, and you always have those. We do have another webinar coming up in March on the perfect campaign, and that's we'll be representing that one from a previous presentation, but it'll be a live session here, but one of our most requested topics on the perfect capital campaign. So watch for that coming up in March. Of course, here at Mission Advancement, many of you know, have been on these webinars before. We are a fundraising consulting firm based in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but work all across the country, and a number of different organizations, whether it be schools or social service agencies or other types of ministries. We always are engaged in helping, whether it be in a capital campaign, planning study previous to a campaign, development strategy and coaching, maybe board training, those sorts of things. But all the things that we do always, as you know, come from a relationship-based perspective, helping you have better relationships with your donors, a deeper connection for your donors to the mission, and putting you in a place where that relationship, you don't wonder and question about it, but you always feel comfortable and confident in the relationship and the connection that your donor has with your organization. So that's a little bit about Mission Advancement, the only bit of sales pitch that we'll do with you today. So let me take a moment now and introduce my colleague, Kyle Queel. Kyle's going to come on and do today's presentation. So Kyle has years and years of experience in development and fundraising in a private school perspective and working with other clients here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and up in the Twin Cities area, Minneapolis, St. Paul as well. Kyle is going to have a great presentation and discussion. You will enjoy his personality and engagement, and a great time in today's discussion of crafting the donor story. So Kyle, it's all yours now. I'll come back for the Q&A at the end.
Chuck, thanks so much. Really appreciate the intro. And listen, thanks to everyone who's on this webinar today for being with us, for taking time out of your busy schedule to hopefully perhaps while eating lunch or doing some things at your desk, joining us on this journey through a discussion about crafting the donor story. I'm really looking forward to it. Hopefully this will be informational and maybe at times entertaining. But listen, a special shout out to all of our friends up in Minnesota. I was just this morning on a phone call with a colleague and was talking about the record-breaking snowfall that you've had up there this past month. So stay warm, and hopefully you guys will thaw out before too long. So crafting the donor story, this is our topic for today. And let me just kind of throw out a few things before we dive into the elements of a story. When we talk about crafting the donor story, now from what you may already know about Mission Advancement and from what you've heard from Chuck in the introduction, you're not going to be surprised to hear that when we come to this topic of crafting the donor story, we approach this from a particular framework, from a certain paradigm, if you will, and that is one of really being a specialist in major and principal fundraising. Our kind of focus here is, as we like to say, as relationship-based purists. So just keep that in mind. I'm talking to a bunch of development professionals all over the country, and I know that we've all been engaged in thinking through donor plans and having coffee with donors and approaching them about opportunities to give and following up with a thank you and some demonstration of gratitude. That's all important. But when we talk about crafting a donor story, we're talking about something much more than simply that. We're talking about something much more creative, and I think you'll find much more fulfilling both for the donor and for those involved as development professionals rather. So let's jump into something that I know is going to be a rehearsal or a review to something we all learned, and really, quite frankly, in early elementary school or grade school, but a little more explicitly as we got into the middle school years, perhaps ninth grade. The basic elements of a story. We all know that a good story involves character. It involves character development within the context of a setting. It involves some movement or action between protagonists and antagonists and supporting roles. It involves conflict. We're going to come back to this very important element, sometimes overlooked, and it involves resolution. The basic elements of a story. You know, if you think about any story that we remember as a child or even as an adult, we're going to find these core elements. They're universal, really, to kind of the arc of a story well told. And this is going to be how we're going to think about this issue of crafting a donor story today. Now, if you're like me, and I'm hoping there aren't too many millennials on this webinar who've never seen a Star Wars. I look back and I think of Star Wars. I think of one of the perennial stories of my youth. When I was a child, I must have seen Star Wars, the original and best Star Wars, the first one, a dozen times. I was a big fan, as I trust many of you hopefully are. And I will say, I think the first three are much better than all those that have come since, but that's perhaps a hot sports opinion that we'll save for another discussion. But when you think about the story of Star Wars, we know the setting in a galaxy far away. We know the fight between the rebels and the evil empire, as it were. We know the main hero, Luke Skywalker, who has that face and that outfit and that laser in his hand that's known worldwide. We have the villain. Is there a better bad guy than Darth Vader? His helmet, his black cape, his deep voice. He knows the power of the dark side. And of course, the whole story of Star Wars is between the good and bad sides of the Force. But it doesn't stop there. And there's so many other characters we could get into. I was particularly fond of Princess Leia as a young man, but lo and behold, don't forget the advisor. Do or not, there is no try. The wise sage who was there to guide Luke Skywalker, the hero, along his journey in seeking to do the right thing and seeking to fight the evil empire and perhaps even help explode the Death Star. So in any good story, you're going to have the good guy, you're going to have the bad guy, and you're going to have the person who comes along and helps in the planning process get kind of the good guy and the good woman through the arc of the plot. And let's transition from that, if you will, to what it really looks like when it comes to kind of another metaphor, and that is similar to that of a story. Think of, if you will, a road trip. With any kind of story where we're going from point A to point B, there's got to be wise planning from the get-go. We're not just kind of haphazard in terms of where we're going. There's an intentional direction of action to get to the desired destination. There's an intentional direction of action to get to the desired destination. Wise planning, in other words, starts with the big picture. Now, perhaps you, like me, went on some road trips as a young person. I remember as a young person going in those station wagons with the fake wood panel on the sides and sitting in the back of the station wagon facing the traffic behind us, not, of course, wearing seat belts. I'm sure few people do that today. It's probably illegal in most states. But imagine if you were living in Florida, perhaps Miami is where that red dot is. And imagine that your parents had the great idea of going on a long road trip across the country to perhaps the yellow dot, let's say that's San Francisco. You're going to go to Fisherman's Wharf or perhaps see Alcatraz. Never been to California. So as a young child, you're very excited about the trip. Now, we know there's some mountain ranges and other impediments that would prevent a straight line trip from happening in planning and plotting the course. That's likely not an option. Plus, sometimes the straight line is kind of boring. And so your parents decide that, maybe we want to stop off there and where is that? Perhaps Nashville, and catch a few shows and concerts and see an old aunt. And then we want to kind of jet to the Northeast and visit the nation's capital and then go back through, who knows, maybe that's Yosemite and then down to San Francisco. Sometimes the course between A and B is not a straight line. Sometimes there are all sorts of turns along the way that can be intended, and that's not an accident. When it comes to relationships and relationship-based fundraising, this is a point that I think is worth noting. We all know that human beings are complex. We're like what Churchill said about Russia. We're a mystery wrapped inside an enigma. People are complex, and we obviously can't simply approach people as simple human beings in a kind of point A to point B way. It takes time to really get to know people, and our whole approach to relationship-based fundraising assumes, in some ways, the wonder and complexity of our donors. It assumes that, guess what, when it comes to major and principal and planned gifts, those are the fruit of relationships, meaningful relationships cultivated over time. And any of us know, and we all have a handful of meaningful relationships, any of us know that those relationships are not cultivated overnight, and that those relationships are not simple ones. They're often complicated, and they've certainly often involved some conflict along the way. When it comes to fundraising, think about those top relationships as those most complex and most meaningful, deep relationships that your organization has with your donors. Of course, there's a place for marketing and events, but that's bringing people in at a kind of a transactional level, not taking them where ultimately you want to take them. So when it comes to crafting the donor story, let's just jump right in and first just emphasize the point that we want to encourage you to think about and really come to understand and learn where the story begins. We knew from our road trip example, we're starting at home. We're starting from Miami. We have to know where we are to know where we're headed. So we go from this first step. Now, let me suggest this. When it comes to kind of beginning to think about where the story begins so that you can better think about where the story should end, consider this. Every nonprofit organization has many stories to tell. There's the story of your reason for your very existence, the mission of your nonprofit. Why do you exist? There's the story of your desired future. Think of this as your vision. Where are you headed? You've got your past, you've got your present, you've got why you exist, but where are you headed? The vision is in essence the chapter of your nonprofit organization, of your story that's yet to be told, its future. But then there's this, and this is often overlooked. There are all the personal stories of those both beneficiaries and benefactors who are in relationship to your organization's story. Every one of you has a story to tell about why you are in the role you're in with your nonprofit organization, whether that's as an active volunteer, whether that's as a board leader, whether that's as a CEO, executive director, whether that's as a VP of advancement or a major gifts officer, or an entry-level development coordinator, or office manager who's responsible for managing donations on Razor's Edge or some other software program. No matter your role, everyone on this webinar right now has a reason, has a story, has a narrative that explains your connection to date as to why you have the relationship you do with your nonprofit organization. So I want you to think about this as well. Every prospect has that same story to tell. I'm afraid sometimes we forget these personal stories and we replace instead this emphasis on our nonprofit story and miss a real opportunity. It's not an either or, it's a both and. Let me suggest this. As development professionals, your responsibility is to bring these stories together in creative and strategic ways to advance your nonprofit's mission for the benefit of all. So let's start with this. Let's start with this story and the character of the story you're wanting to tell with a prospective donor. What do we know about our prospective donor? Hopefully you know something more than just her name. So when you think about crafting the donor story, you've got to begin at the beginning. You've got to begin with the main character. So let's assess the current situation. What's the prospect's relevant connection to our mission? What's the prospect's relevant connection to our mission? What's their history? Why do they know us the way they do? Why are they connected? What is his or her past giving and involvement? Is this someone who has just come to perhaps a special event and has sat at the table of a rubber chicken dinner for a gala and for the first time has given a transactional gift to your organization? Or is this someone who's been involved from the very beginning, who's been an active member from the beginning of your nonprofit, and perhaps you're the one that's new and you're trying to get to know this person because they're in your portfolio and you're responsible to cultivate their giving and hopefully see it grow? What specific aspect of the mission does he or she most connect with? You know, in our experience, unfortunately, it's not uncommon for this particular question to be sometimes overlooked. We assume a lot about people who have demonstrated their commitment to our nonprofit organizations over the years through their volunteerism, through their financial support. But how often is it that someone has pulled such a person aside over a cup of coffee with no ulterior motive and simply ask, why is it that you're connected the way that you are? You're an amazing example of the kind of people we want supporting our organization. But I don't know if anybody's ever asked you, but why do you do what you do? What motivates you to do all that you do in service to our nonprofit? It might be a very powerful conversation, and it might, quite frankly, somewhat surprise and delight the donor and the volunteer to be asked such a question. You want to think about this. Obviously, in any kind of planning for a donor engagement, you want to think about who does have access, who has influence with the prospect, who might we need to call upon to play some supporting roles in the story of this donor. And then what is the perceived giving capacity of the prospect? We'll talk a little more about this momentarily, but you need to know before the story begins and before you seek to take that donor from point A to point B, what might they be able to do? If they make this particular opportunity that exists with our nonprofit at this time, what might they be able to do financially if this were truly a priority? We obviously don't have access to donors' bank's account, and we don't know how else they may be committed, but there's generally going to be a way, in various ways, to have an informed idea, at least a perception about how much someone could give. And then what's the backstory? What else do we need to know that might be going on in this individual's life that could influence how we go about working with them, or perhaps influence how we go about thinking about pausing our planned engagement? We all know that, as has been mentioned, donors are people too. And people have sometimes things in their lives which complicate their lives. If a donor has a parent that's deathly ill, if a donor is going through some family challenges, if a donor's company is on the verge of bankruptcy, not the best time to engage such a donor for a significant gift. You need to know the backstory. Cultivating a donor is not the ideal time to find out about a backstory. At that time, it's kind of too little, too late. So if we don't know the answers, we need to build in time for discovery. And let me just highlight the emphasis of time. You all know this who've been involved in development for any length of time, that so often we rush donors in seeking to meet metrics and raise money. whether it's for annual fund efforts or whether it's for a capital campaign endeavor, donors need time, and we respect donors and dignify donors by giving them the time they deserve. And we need time to get to know them, to discover our donors, to deepen their connection to our organization, and to really kind of get to know their heart. Let's move on to not only where the story begins, but then begin to think about how the story will end. Where are you taking the donor along the way? So what do we hope to accomplish with this donor? Begin with the end in mind. Don't simply engage, not knowing where you hope to take them. What are you seeking to do? What is the final act, as it were, when you sit down and invite that donor to make a significant investment in your nonprofit? We think it's important to envision that and to really plan for that, so that every move along the way is intended to move that donor in that direction. Back to our example of the road trip. We're based in Miami. We're going to end up in San Francisco. We're not just going to meander all around the country, not knowing which exits to take, not knowing where we're headed. We want to put into our Google app or our map app or whatever it may be, not the Mapsco that I used as a youngster. We want to put in the destination so that we can take the right road to get there. So be thinking about what you want to accomplish with your donor. Obviously, in terms of what you want to accomplish, it kind of begs that question. How much could a donor actually give? What is their financial capacity? Well, question, how can we know how to answer that? How can we know what a prospect could potentially give? Well, first, let's just state what I've already suggested. We can't. We can't with absolute assurance, at least. Sometimes we have better knowledge than at other times. But at the end of the day, we have to be comfortable with knowing there is a science and there is an art to cultivating relationship-based donors. And when it comes to knowing what a prospect would or could give, we can't ultimately know with absolute assurance that answer. And we have to be okay with that. But it doesn't mean we can't move forward in an informed and strategic way. We are seeking to make an educated guess. And of course, there are all sorts of ways to seek to do that, that you all know about and that we often engage with clients to help do. We must factor in the value that we will add to the equation. Now, sometimes this point is not properly acknowledged, but think about this. There should be a big difference between what a donor in relationship to your organization would give, between a solicitation to give via the mail or via email or simply by virtue of a phone call, and what they would give in turn if you personally were to begin to build a meaningful relationship with them over a period of time. You and I can't control, obviously, how much someone can give. We can't know how much they will give, but we can add value to the equation of how much at the end of the day they do give. We have to be comfortable with not knowing. Development, as I suspect most of you know, is not an exact science. We must develop confidence in what we can influence, and we can influence a lot. You know, if you've ever played sports or been a coach or been part of a team, you practice. You practice, and you practice as perfectly as you can. And then you go to play the game. At the end of the day, you do everything you can to control the outcome of that game, but you know you can't ultimately predict with certainty the outcome because you're playing other people, and other people can influence action and destination as well. But there's a lot as development professionals that we can influence, and we must do that with confidence. Let's move on to the third point. And for me, quite frankly, this is in some ways the highlight of this workshop. So if any of you happen to have nodded off, now's a good time to wake up, because this is where I think it gets really interesting. Identify the conflict in the story. Now, many of you might be thinking, conflict? That's something I don't like. I like to avoid conflict. And here at Mission Advancement, we don't have some kind of pathological preoccupation with conflict. However, we've really come to see over the last few years that thinking about donor relationships with this framework of stories has at its heart conflict. And that conflict is a very powerful element when it comes to meaningful donor relationships. Now, let me unpack that, lest you kind of misinterpret what I'm suggesting. When it comes to this cycle, we know that a donor story is cyclical. You have the plot, you have the characters, the donors, you have your organization, you have the various kind of things going on as to where you're taking these donors. You move them through conflict, some issue that needs resolution, and then that in turn continues to kind of feed into the ongoing narrative of your nonprofit's unfolding story. So we know that's kind of how this works. It's not just kind of a one and done. You can think of it in this way. Your nonprofit organization, it really is in many ways a bunch of small stories that are constantly in flux. Stories involving staff, stories involving board members, stories involving donors, and they're all part of the unfolding drama that is your nonprofit as it moves into the future. But again, the thing that's often overlooked is this element of conflict. We too often go from need, donor with money, ask, fulfillment. There's so much more to how it should work that I think will actually make all the more meaningful the entire experience, particularly for your donor, but also for you. And conflict is key to that. Now, without conflict, we know that a story is boring. Imagine Star Wars without Darth Vader or the Death Star. Imagine any story without the bad guy. I'm thinking of Die Hard without Hans. It just doesn't make sense. Great stories have great conflict. Now, speaking of conflict, you could make the case that the absence of conflict or the absence of controversy may have been why the ratings for watching the Oscars this past Sunday night were particularly low. I think one of the lowest in history since such things have been recorded. Suspecting, just guessing, that perhaps one of the reasons for that is we all know there wasn't a host. Perhaps the Oscars were somewhat boring. Now, they still went long, apparently, but perhaps they were boring. You didn't have to watch the Oscars to know this. The nominees for Best Picture: A Star is Born, Black Panther, BlacKkKlansman, Bohemian Rhapsody, Green Book that won, and The Favorite. Then there's also Vice. Now, full confession, I've not seen one of these films. I hope that many of you have seen some of them. Some of you have perhaps seen all of them. I have a friend that's seen every one of these. I hope to see these sometime this next year. But if we took time to just open it up right now for discussion, which we're not going to do about this, but we could go through each of these stories. We could go through the plots of each of these movies. We could talk through the main characters. We could talk about kind of what's happening in terms of the direction and the arc of the storyline. But I would guarantee that there is not one of these films that's been nominated for Best Picture for an Oscar that doesn't have at its center major conflict. And of course, we know that really good stories not only develop characters in meaningful, in-depth ways, but often have layers upon layers upon layers of conflict. Just when you think resolution, there's more conflict. So what is conflict? Well, conflict, we know generally, is a problem to solve. It's an opportunity to seize. From a donor perspective, from a relationship-based fundraising perspective, it's a problem your organization is facing. It's something that's an impediment to your desired future. Think of conflict in this way, whether it's a major capital campaign conflict, you're trying to grow, but you don't have a building to fit your needs, whether it's that or whether it's even a smaller annual fund conflict. You're a school that has a bunch of elementary kids and you don't have a playground. There's a problem that needs to be solved. Put positively, there's an opportunity to seize. There's a challenge to overcome. I mean, let's face it, many of our best donors are people who have been very successful in their own businesses and professional lives. They're people who thrive in fixing problems. They're people who are assertive in taking on opportunities and challenges to overcome. People want something measurable. Donors thrive when they're given an opportunity to do something with measurable results that a prospect can resolve. These are some of the key ways to think about conflict, but we're going to be unpacking this a little further in the moments we have left. So as you think about your donor, the character, where the story begins, you think about where you want to take them, how the story ends. You think about the conflict in a way that you want to present to that character, a conflict to overcome. Now we want to kind of unpack a little more the characters and the roles required for this to unfold. Now, one of the things I want you to think about is this, and this fits right in with the mindset of looking at your donor base as characters that you can put in stories. And if you kind of have this shift, this mind shift, if you will, I think it could bring a kind of renewed energy and vigor and creativity into your role as a fundraising professional. What is your role in your nonprofit story? I don't know if you've thought of it in this way, but I would suggest this. Yes, of course, you're a professional fundraiser. No matter your role, I'm guessing you're on this webinar because in some way or another, you're involved in fundraising. As such, you are responsible for funding the mission. That's pretty straightforward, right? That's what a fundraiser does. But here's where it gets fun. You get to be the director of memorable, moving, mission-advancing donor experiences. Have you thought of it in that way? You know, it's too bad that every development professional doesn't have a director's chair in their office where they could sit in it on occasion to get creative about your portfolio and the characters within it. Every one of your donors is a different, distinct human being with a different history, a different story to tell. They're headed in a different direction. They're interested in different things. They have different financial capacity, different temperaments, different personalities. This is fascinating. Of any calling and career, being a fundraising professional of all things should be anything but boring. You get to cast characters and craft stories. That's your job. And I think that's something that should be considered a lot of fun. Now, let's think about the characters in the story. Sometimes nonprofits get a little confused. In fact, I've actually been in a meeting before where some board members for a nonprofit got a little confused. They were talking about a donor and talked about themselves being the hero in the story. We said, no. Let's rethink that. When it comes to crafting a donor story, the donor is the hero. The donor is the one invited to slay the dragon. The donor is the one invited to save the damsel in distress. The donor is the one who is going to overcome the challenge, overcome the barrier, overcome whatever it is that stands between where the nonprofit is today and where you're seeking to go. Who will be the wise advisor? Who will be the Yoda? Now, we're not simply talking here about professional consultants, though they may have a role to play. You as the development professional, you're the wise advisor. You're the one who, as the director, gets to speak into all the different nuanced elements of this complex story. You're the one who gets to think about what other supporting roles are necessary. Who else should play some kind of supporting role in this story? Now, you typically don't want too many other people involved, right? But there might be one or two, maybe three key roles that someone or some people could play along the way. Sometimes you don't need to have them play a role the entire way. Sometimes they play a role on the front end. Sometimes you might bring them in kind of mid-trip. Sometimes you might bring somebody in at the end. Perhaps this is a really close friend that is in a place to help take that donor to a special place. Perhaps it's a credible leader. It's the CEO or executive director or board chair. And you know that this is the kind of donor who, while they appreciate a relationship with a major gift officer or even the chief development officer, they want to hear from the big kahuna. They want to hear from the executive leader of the organization and or perhaps the board chair. Perhaps it's someone who brings in some expertise. Perhaps that's the kind of a thing that your donor is looking for, someone who can speak with real expertise on whatever issue might be under consideration, whatever issue might be connected to the conflict, to the thing that needs to be overcome. Keep in mind, as has been said, more is not always better when it comes to characters. Better to be nimble and flexible, or as sometimes I like to say, lean, but not so mean. Have a handful of people who you know can play a meaningful role. What you don't want is to bring in characters that perhaps you've not thought about enough, and you bring them in prematurely into the drama, and what they end up doing is just that, creating unnecessary drama, and perhaps even sometimes unwittingly hijacking the story and taking it in directions you don't want. So it's really important that you have a unified front and vision as to who's involved in the story with your particular donor, and that everybody is seeking to take that donor, though in different ways, to the desired destination. Okay, lastly, as we wrap up crafting the donor story, we've talked about where the story begins. We've talked about where you want to take donors as to the desired end. We talked about identifying conflict, which is key. We've talked about kind of thinking about other characters and roles that need to play a critical part of this story if it's gonna happen. But now what do? It all sounds fun, right? It all sounds good. Maybe for some of you, this is getting your creative juices flowing, and you're thinking, hey, maybe being a development professional is actually a lot of fun. Maybe this is something I could kind of do for a while with this kind of mindset, with this approach. So what we would recommend is this. At this point, don't just stop. Let's take this into some action and do what we would call storyboarding. Now, what is storyboarding? Now, I don't know where that term first kind of began, but I suspect, and some of my colleagues have suggested, that it began with our friends at Disney World, perhaps Walt Disney himself. I think that David Becker is someone who worked with Disney early on. And of course, we all know and love many of the classics in the Disney repertoire. And of course, all of those are in many ways the same thing told in different settings with different characters. But again, just good stories with wicked witches and princesses and Prince Charmings and toads or frogs and all that kind of stuff. But here's what it comes down to. Those stories, those classics, are all the fruit of storyboarding. The storyboard's primary value is that it forces you to have a reason for and a consistent approach to everything that you do. When you storyboard, it forces you to really visualize and put up on the wall, if you will, where you're beginning and where you want to end. And it forces us to think about every step in between. Storyboarding, from our view, really is donor planning. But I hope what you're seeing from everything we're sharing today, that it's so much more than simply doing some donor screening, picking out a handful of donors, calling them to have coffee, having coffee, and asking them about their gift to your organization, and then making an ask at a future time and following that up with perhaps a receipt for the gift and a handwritten thank you note. That's all fine and well, but let's face it, that alone is kind of boring. And that alone doesn't, quite frankly, reflect the kind of value that I know you all want to share and to show with your most meaningful donors. So we would say that storyboarding is the way to really think about donor planning moving forward. So why storyboard a donor plan? Why make a donor plan so much more robust and alive than it otherwise typically would be? Well, a few things. One, storyboarding as an exercise, it does suggest creativity. And again, this is where it can be quite fun. Imagine sitting around a conference room table with one or two other people from your organization, perhaps a fellow staff member and perhaps a member of your board or development committee. And you want to, in confidence, talk for a bit about a donor. And you want to solicit from these other people who know the donor in a different way information about that donor. What is it that makes them tick? What's their history? Why are they connected with us? What do they like? What do they not like? Do they have any beef with our organization? All of that is creative, and it gets the juices flowing. It also provides a critical lens to view the plan that you're trying to put together. You know, if we all kind of look at something on our own, we tend to get very myopic and we can kind of live in our own little echo chamber. When we invite a few other people to look at something with us, it obviously gives a different perspective. And sometimes that different perspective can help us see things that we're blind to. So it provides a critical lens to make this a collaborative engagement. Every donor plan should have all the elements of a story. This is not brain surgery, right? We're talking about some pretty basic elements, but ones that are often not fully taken advantage of. Think about the plot. Think about your characters. Think about the conflict. Think about the desired resolution, and put on paper, put up on a wall with some of those gigantic 3M sticky board themajigs and some markers, every one of these elements of a good story, and fill it out for each particular donor. And again, as has been mentioned, it's a collaborative thing. This is not something that one person can do effectively on their own. This certainly is not something that some professional consultant can come in and do for you. Certainly, people like Matt can facilitate this engagement, and we do this all the time. But we believe that relationships are meaningful, and that meaningful relationships are all about people who are in relationship with other people who know them. You need to have people who know your donors personally engaged in this collaborative and creative effort. And again, it provides consideration of the whole story. Not only do you look at this from a critical viewpoint, but you also look at it from beginning to end and everything in between. Now, speaking of the whole story, the plot ends up in conflict and resolution. We know that the plot in this crafting of a donor story should be all about not just maintaining the status quo, not just kind of keeping the donor where they are in the drama of your nonprofit, but actually bringing them into a place, in some ways, of managed crisis. This is not, it's not artificial, it's not manipulative. You have a genuine problem. You have a genuine need. Well, one, you don't have enough money. None of us do, right? We've never been a nonprofit that has said, yeah, we're good. We've got enough money. You've got a need for more money, not just to have more money. You need more money to advance your mission. And that comes through the need for particular funds, for a particular project, particular programs, whatever it may be. Those are your conflicts. And so the whole story here requires you in your plot to thinking about bringing your donor in a more managed and purposeful way into knowledge of this conflict, into kind of insider's knowledge, which in turn leads to resolution and does in turn lead to fulfillment. And as we saw earlier, this entire thing continues to be cyclical. It doesn't simply end there. You don't just solve all the conflict that a nonprofit faces and live happily ever after. This is a recurring situation, a recurring drama annually. And certainly if you're in a capital campaign, it's even a more significant drama that occurs often every 4 to 5 years in a nonprofit's life together. So let's kind of break this down in what may be for some of you a bit kind of cheesy perhaps, or some of you may begin to reminisce and think about your own experience here, either from your own situation or from people you know. So question, what is the most commonly recounted story from people we know? Think about it. Just take a minute. I don't know how many out there might be coming to this conclusion, but if you're like us, and in our experience around here, it's often that of the proposal. Will you marry me? So let's kind of just, in a fun way, play out kind of the process of a proposal, of somebody asking somebody else for their hand in marriage. And this will give a kind of illustration of what we mean by a storyboard. It seems like many people spend a lot of time preparing for their proposal. Yeah, perhaps in some ways more than they do for their marriage itself. But lest I get sidetracked, when it comes to preparing for your proposal, a lot of people put in a lot of time, right? So let's start from the beginning. Let's see how this kind of plays out from the perspective, from the paradigm of a storyboarding approach. So you've got these characters, right? oh, he's cute, she's beautiful. They don't know each other, but all of a sudden they kind of connect on some level. They meet. Okay, we've got two characters. The plot thickens. They meet, they begin to spend more time with each other, and then things really change when one of them drops the L word. Now, depending on where the other person is, that may create some conflict, right? But anyway, but let's say they both love each other, and let's say this is not yet the point of conflict. Here's where the conflict begins. We can't live apart. We just love each other so much. We can't envision life together. We can't envision our individual stories not being about being together for the future. Here's, in a sense, the conflict, because we don't know how this is going to play out. Now, you hope you know at this point if you get down on one knee with an expensive ring in your hand, but in a sense, the conflict is this right here. Some people would see this as the resolution, but the conflict is the question of, will you marry me? And it's really only a short-term resolution when the wedding occurs, and in fact the space between the two is closed, and the two have become one, and all of this, right? That's the short-term resolution. The wedding itself, the conflict is this question of, will you marry me? The wedding is the resolution, and of course the long-term resolution is happily ever after. As we all know, though, who've been married or have children, and or both, there's all sorts of wonderful opportunity for conflict along the way, even after the wedding and as you begin to have kids. But this gives you, if nothing else, an idea of what we mean by a storyboard. Again, this is somewhat simple, but it hopefully gives you a kind of way to think about the development of a basic story and the kind of intentionality, creativity, and collaboration that can go into this. I've heard of some crazy stories before of people getting engaged at baseball games on the big jumbotron, or perhaps hiding a ring and a cupcake, with a special picnic in a park where they had their first kiss, and your friends in the bushes filming it all. And there's a lot of elaborate preparation that can go into these things, just like they can with donors. So bottom line, when it comes to storyboarding, and that's really what we're talking about here, our aim in storyboarding a donor is this: to compose an unforgettable experience for a donor that he or she will recount for years to come. In the same way that for years later, people often recount and share how they got engaged. We want your donors to look back years later and think about how meaningful it was for them to be brought in to your nonprofit story in the way that you've brought them in. So crafting a donor story, just to review, start with how the story ends. What is the desired destination? Create a path that can get you there. Don't forget to do that. Address these three quick questions, important questions. How will we manage a gift of this size? Are we prepared to get the kind of destination that we desire? We need to be prepared along the way in case it resolves in a way that we hope it would. What is the impact of this gift? What are we thinking about in terms of how we can show how lives are being changed for the good, and creative ways that we can demonstrate that fulfillment to our donor? That's all part of your donor story. And then what is the core problem opportunity? What is the conflict we're asking the prospect to solve? Some of you may need to get off this webinar and huddle up with some colleagues and think about, what are the conflicts today that our nonprofit organization is most facing that could be overcome, that could be resolved in time through some donors with the capacity and the conviction to help us do so. And then when it comes down to it, when it comes down to getting to that place where a donor has been brought into your nonprofit and taken through the story, and they're ready for you to, if you will, get down on your knee and ask a specific request. A couple things. Hopefully at that point, one, you feel confident that you know the answer. You know that donor so well. You're not simply going into some bar and asking for somebody for their hand in marriage that you've never met. You're at a place in your relationship where you know how they're going to respond, but you want to present a specific request. You want to ask them for something. You don't simply want to ask for just a general gift. Again, it ties back to a specific request that ties back to a specific conflict that you're putting before a specific potential hero to resolve. So that brings us, I can't believe it, we're already here to the conclusion of our webinar today on crafting a donor story. I know we've only scratched the surface, but I think my colleague Chuck Anderson is going to come back to join us here, and we may have a few questions that people have brought up to us. Chuck, good to see you again.
Yeah, we're back, and you can grab a drink of water or something if you need to, Kyle. Thank you. Good discussion. Lots of great concepts. I thought maybe I'd come back and introduce you and say now we're going to go back to Cecil B. DeQuille, since we're the director of all this stuff.
Wow.
We're having fun. We're having fun. So questions that we're going to walk through now. Obviously, we've had a few that have come through already, but everyone should feel free to use that questions tab that is in your webinar control panel. Type in your question there. That's going to come to me. I'll share these, and in the last about 5-6 minutes that we've got here, Kyle's going to walk through some answers to a few of these questions. So here's the first question that we've got. Someone says, our fundraising revolves mostly around our events each year. How do we get the story concept into that, or can it even be done?
Wait, repeat that for me once again,
yes,
Chuck.
Our fundraising revolves mostly around, excuse me, mostly around our events each year. How do we get the story concept into those events, or can it even be done?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me say one thing first. We have a webinar that is a free webinar in our library on donor-centered special events that I could highly recommend. I think it would give some really creative ideas as to how to answer this question. But let me just say this. If you're in a nonprofit setting where events play a really significant role, and perhaps the major thing within your philanthropy strategy, we're not against events. Done well, an event can be a platform for you to really articulate at a high level your organization story, and it also can be a place where you give people whose lives have been changed through your organization a chance to share their own story. Yeah. So I would think about crafting the event in a way that really focuses on your nonprofit organization story, and that does seek to remove anything that distracts from the story. You know, unless you're let me just say this, and then we'll move on to another question. Unless you're a golf organization that uses golf to develop the character of young people or something like this, does a golf tournament really make sense in advancing and highlighting your mission? Does a silent auction really make sense in doing that? Think about your event and think about a way to craft and execute your event that really is centered around your mission and those whose lives have been changed by it.
I love that. Great concept. Next question says, you mentioned in step number 1, getting to know the donor, but I'm having trouble getting a meeting with our top donor. He says he's too busy. What should I do to get that meeting with our top donor?
Oh, that's a real issue, right? Because busy, what's the saying? Busy people get things done, but often busy people are really hard to meet with. Sure. And it's not uncommon that some of our biggest donors are busy women and men. And a couple thoughts. One, maybe you're not the right person to reach out to this person. Maybe there's a need to bring somebody else in to see if they could get a connection, or maybe tee up for you a meeting. So that's one thought. Just step back and think about some other people who might know this person, and perhaps have a private conversation with a handful of people to say, who knows this person well? Who could perhaps reintroduce me into the dynamic? Or perhaps I need to hand this person over to someone else's portfolio. It may just be that some of us don't connect with other people, and other people are going to have a better chemistry. Chuck, I wish we had time to talk about our friends up in Chicago. This is a quick story I'll share very briefly, and this had to do more with the capital campaign opportunity. Their biggest donor had never visited with them at their location. He wouldn't come from out of state to visit for whatever reason, and so we helped them make a very creative video with a couple of children who are just precious, and how they basically went through the process of telling him the directions on how to drive from out of state to get to their headquarters in Chicago. It was a simple little video made with a phone, and guess what? He ended up coming. So you might have to get creative as well.
All right. Next question is from a school setting. It says, my head of school is pushing me to get another $200,000 in the door by the end of the school year. How can I build a donor story when I'm under deadline all the time?
I know I laugh just because I'm sitting here thinking, I know that's not uncommon I'm sorry that you've gotten that kind of, it sounds like late addition to your goal for this school year. That in itself may not be a worthwhile conflict to get many donors to give, right? It's kind of, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Please help me meet this goal by the end of the school year. One quick response would be simply this. That's obviously an unexpected challenge. That's taking what you need to raise to a whole new level. Think ways that you can find fundable projects within your school's budget, opportunities that you could carve out and present to donors that could help you get to that 200. We all know that just kind of being asked to give to this bucket is not terribly effective. It's not going to generate extraordinary gifts at the level we're talking about in crafting a donor story. Consider ways to break this 200,000 down into real life fundable needs.
Love it.
And put those needs into the context of your school's bigger story. Don't stick with just, we need to raise this by the end of the school year. That story is not going to get anybody excited. Put each need in the context of a bigger mission and a bigger opportunity to advance your school's mission.
Exactly right. And what it comes down to, the timing, it's not about our timing at the school, it's about the donor's timing and when their gift takes place. That's what the priority always needs to be. So we're going to do one last question here. The question says, the concept of the donor story seems like it would likely lead to designated gifts. My CFO says our need is for unrestricted funding. How can I reconcile this? And so maybe a similar concept of these fundable projects.
Right. Well, and I know, Chuck, this is one that we're constantly kind of chewing on and working through with clients and other nonprofit organizations. We know that CFOs and controllers love undesignated gifts. But at the end of the day, like with campaign opportunities where people may want to connect their name to a particular project, when it comes down to it, money is green, no matter where it goes within a budget. And, designated gifts, we think, may generate more transformational levels of giving for particular fundable projects than if you simply ask for a generic gift to go towards a gap. And so there's a balance here. You obviously want some non-designated monies coming into your nonprofit organization, but if you can really think in a very strategic and coordinated way, we believe you can actually work with donors who want to give their particular gifts to specific needs that have been presented to them and done in conjunction with the strategic priorities of your organization.
Outstanding. I love it. And thank you all for the questions. Sorry we weren't able to get to all of them today, but we did make a promise we would finish at 1 o'clock, and here we are exactly 1 o'clock. So just a reminder, we will send a link by email for you to watch a full video recording of today's presentation. You can also find all of our other presentations for free at missionadvancement.com. And remember our webinar coming up next month in March. Watch for details on that. We'll be doing the perfect campaign for those of you who are looking at a capital campaign sometime soon. So Kyle, thank you. Appreciate the insights. Very helpful. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. Y'all have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.